Hello, my name is Margaret Adele and welcome to my August wrap-up, and this one is going to be even more indie focused than usual. I didn't know that was possible, but this last month I did Indie August, wherein I tried to get as many reviews out as I could. Now, not every book I read was for review and not every book was indie, but for the most part it was pretty in-depth. So let's jump right into it with one of my new favorites, and that is The Songbird's Refrain by Julian Maria. This is a queer YA body horror, somewhat similar to Wilder Girls, only with a little bit more of a fantasy bent than the sci-fi bent. This involves a young queer woman, I believe lesbian, named Elizabeth, who goes to this art show, but it's not everything that it seems, and she sees this woman with all these feathers sticking out of her die in front of her, and suddenly wakes up in the cage that woman was in and now finds herself trapped in there, and feathers slowly start to sprout. It was beyond creepy. I loved the representation. I loved how I wanted to punch the villains in the face. I gave this a full 5-star review, and I will link that in the description. There's going to be so many links in the description this time, but it can't be helped. I got a lot of reviews out this month. And in general, I'm shocked that this book hasn't come out yet, because it feels like I've been in love with it for forever, but it's not out until September 3rd. So come September 3rd, if you liked Wilder Girls, check this one out. Up next is another new favorite, Tavern by Destin Munden. Destin is a long-term Twitter mutual of mine, one of the first people I followed and followed me back on Twitter. So when he published a book, I was super, super eager to review it for him. This is a D&D slice of life style high fantasy, meaning that while, yes, there is some big things happening, you still get a lot of more chill moments in between. I mentioned in the review that it almost reads like a series of short stories. It follows an orc named Zelnath, and I loved that the protagonist was an orc. You almost never see them as a protagonist. They're almost always, at best, a side character, at worst, a villain. And it also, and I mentioned this review too, that it definitely comes across as some racial coding, because Destin Munden is an author of color. He is black. So if you're looking for high fantasy not written by a white dude like everyone seems to complain, this one is it. I gave it 4 stars. The only issue being that there were some moments where I felt could use more attention, and then potentially could use more bad things, more or less. And again, I went into full review there, so I'm not going to do too in-depth here. But I'm super excited that I love this so much, because it's always weird reading your friends' books, and I can't wait to continue with the series. Up next is A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone. I read this for the monthly book club. I'm really excited that there's a new popular book club on BookTube that does mostly indie books. Now, granted, these are mostly indie erotica, but I like that too, so it's fine. I didn't even have to break free of indie books to do this one. So this one, not a lot happened. Essentially, 6 bisexual people are all in a house together and decide to bring back this old-fashioned sex ritual. And that's it. There's not a lot. There's a lot more angst. There's a lot more talking about how attracted they are to each other, and talking about their past, because they all spent a summer together as children, and bringing that back up. I've heard the sequel is supposed to be just horrible, so I don't know that I'll continue with it, but I probably will pick up another monthly pick again in the future, and I've already maybe been making some suggestions of my own. Up next, I went back to review books, and that's for Forgetting Chuck Taylor by Bailey Peters. This is an FF romance between a wedding planner and a young woman who's kind of getting back on her feet off of a felony. And I loved the premise of this. I loved the idea of it. I ended up only giving it 3 stars because the author is not an LGBT woman, and that's not an issue. She did write this in honor of all of her LGBT friends that never get to see themselves in happy stories. But in general, I don't know if it was because of that the writing felt a little too detached, and there were some things that were kind of like glossed over, and moments where I would have loved to feel the full angst of it. I didn't really get it, but it was a delightful FF romance, and involving some bigger commentary on the state of the wedding industry and LGBT marriage. So I would definitely pick this up if you like cute, quick romances, but also would like to see more queer versions. Next up came a book I didn't know I would like as much as I did. I was actually nervous to start reading it, but I had it for review, so I thought I'd give it a try, and that is Then Came Darkness by D.H. Schleicher. This is an historical thriller wherein a man feels cheated when a job, a criminal-esque job he pulls goes wrong, and he vows revenge on the man that screwed him over and his entire family. This takes place during the Great Depression, and I mentioned in the review that something about that backdrop, that pall of hopelessness and despair that permeated the entire country during the Great Depression makes for like a perfect, like dark, depressing backdrop for a thriller. I think, did I give this 4 or 5 stars? I can't remember. I think the only issue I had was there were some things at the ending I would have liked to see written out. But if you're got a thing for serial killers and historical fiction or dark, creepy, maybe slightly depressing and maybe a little bit melodramatic things, this is definitely the book for you. Next up is The Unfettered Child by Michael C. Sod. I have not gotten a review out for this yet. I meant to. I was actually asked by the author to hold up for a bit because I read the e-copy and his exact words were, he likes the videos best when I wave around fancy book covers. So I will be getting the review video out when I get the physical copy. This is a high fantasy about this young girl named Samara who lives with her tribe on the plains and may have had a rather strange birth, but I don't want to get too much into it. But when her tribe is attacked by elves, and I do like that the elves were bad guys here, they are supposed to be enslaved, but she unleashes this power she didn't know she had with disastrous results. And her father, believing both her and his wife, believes his wife is alive, believing her dead, takes off to track down the elves while Samara struggles to understand her brand new powers and find her father and mother again. I liked the concept of it. I liked some of the plot at the beginning. It kind of lost it a little bit for me. And also, I was going to wait to the review to say this, but minor thing, I don't want to call it problematic, just not the best look. The only character coded as queer in the entire story was this one-off shaman dude that was kind of predatory. And that's it. Like, he leers at one of the other male protagonists, makes the other male protagonist uncomfortable, and then he's never popped up again. So that kind of bugged me. But in general, decent high fantasy. The plot was there. It just wasn't as character driven as I'd been expecting, or as a lot of the publications around it, I guess you could say, touted it as being. In fact, it felt kind of like an older style, like of high fantasy from the 90s or early 2000s, very much more plot driven. So that might have affected why I only gave it a 3-star. But if you like very, very gigantic stakes and a lot of destruction, this one's for you. Next up is a book that I was excited to read, and then nervous to read, and then excited to read, and that is Ascendant by Kimberly Gray. This is about 2 warring factions of angels. I believe it is YA, although it's kind of hard to guess because the main character is technically young for her species, but she's like 140 years old, and I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to translate to, if it is an exact 10-to-1 and she's 14, but I'm not sure. The people do call her Fledgling, but Grace is an up-and-coming saboteur, meaning that she is meant to be a spy, and on her very first mission to ferret out the secrets of the bad guys, she gets captured. And she finds out that the Black Wings, these bad guys that she was told for her entire life are horrible people, may not be what she thought they were. And it's a lot of, what is this war actually about? Who are the actual villains? And I was really intrigued by this premise. I love that kind of, is the villain really just the, black-hearted bad guy, or is there more to this? And then I got nervous because I was researching it, and I saw somewhere that it was labeled as Christian fantasy. Now, that doesn't usually bug me. However, if you watched last month's wrap-up, you'll know that the last Christian fantasy I read was just awful and proselytizing and a beat for beat retelling of the crucifixion and all of that. So I was really nervous. However, thankfully, there's none of that in here. There's no Christ analogy. There's definitely themes if you know your Bible or know the general teachings in more of a vague sense than a strict, like no one's ever quoted the Bible. They are there, but it's nothing overt. It's nothing like convert, beating you over the head. And I actually got a message from the author after I put up the review, and she said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to overlook the fact that it was Christian. I wasn't trying to trick you or anything." And I said, no, it's fine. In general, you could read this being outside the faith like me, and it's fine. I just was a little bit worried that it was going to be more in your face than it was, and thankfully, nice and subdued. There's a delightful platonic relationship in here that I loved. And in general, I would definitely suggest this, even if you're in the religion, if you're out of it, if you just like a good YA fantasy. And again, indie YA fantasy continues to be my preferred YA. Just how it goes. So after Ascendant, I began to feel the first inklings of a slump, and I like to practice mindfulness where if I feel the inklings, I immediately take steps to solve it rather than wait for it to turn into a full-on slump. So I decided to veer off indie for a hot minute and just read a book for fun that I could read quickly, and for that I read Freaks by Kieran Larwood. This is a Victorian novel about this young group of circus sideshow kids who realized that these other group of kids called mudlarks, aka the kids that would go through the mud on the Thames to find treasures because they're that poor, go missing, and so they decided to uncover them. And I enjoyed this one. The author held no punches. She showed Victorian London as it really was, i.e., incredibly filthy and covered in muck, and it's hard to breathe and disgusting. Like, my skin was crawling while I was reading this, but historically accurate, so I couldn't falter too much. It was adorable, made great. I think this might be the beginning of a series. I'm not sure, but in general, I picked this up from like a thrift store a while ago for ultra cheap, and it looked really cute, and it was, and it might have helped save me from a slump. So in my continuing quest to fight off a slump, when I did go back to review books, I decided to go for a poetry book, and that is Breaking Free by Caitlin Derwan. I know it's not pronounced the way it's spelled. It's Derwan, not Derwin, as I wanted to pronounce it originally. This is a poetry book all about a dark time in the poet's life and coming out the other side of it. There were a lot of mentions of things like anxiety, depression. There is content warnings for sexual assault and cutting. However, I believe there's only one or two poems that reference the self-harm directly. But I really liked the artistic way she said it. Caitlin Derwan, not Derwan. Caitlin Derwan is naturally a fiction writer, and now I'm really intrigued to see what her fiction is like after the poetry, because I really did enjoy this. And because it was a poetry book, I was able to finish it in one day. It ends on a very hopeful note, kind of coming out the other side of this really dark time, which I like because I feel like a lot of poetry books tend to be all focused on the dark times to the point where you're just sad coming out of it. But this one is like, yes, all these things happened, but this is what I've learned and this is how I'm moving forward. And I really appreciated that. I believe I gave this 5 stars. Up next was a book that I'd been making myself put off because I couldn't rush into reading it just after actually asking for it. This is a review copy I personally asked for, but the premise just sounded so intriguing, and that is Deference by Leela Meena. This is the first in the Temper trilogy, all set in Japan. And of course, I asked the author if she was Japanese or had done research, and she said that she is a Caucasian woman living in Japan, has lived in Japan, like her son is going to a Japanese primary school. So most of it's from her own life, and I appreciated that. This is all about a young woman from, I believe, Canada or Italy, I'm not sure which, who is living in Japan and takes Aikido classes and may have a thing for her Aikido instructor. It turns out Honda-san's got a thing for her too. So Lana ends up with a very short fling with him that is very, it's all consensual. All of it is consenting. But what they consent to do is intense if you've never read an erotica before. I mentioned in the review that this is not your mother's grocery store romance. This is very much a case of you've read a lot of erotica and you're tired of the same old thing and you want this instead. It's a lot tougher. She ends up breaking off the romance fairly quickly, but then discovers that Honda-san's married, but JK, his wife's actually into it, and his wife is bisexual and also wants Lana-san. And so she ends up in a polyamorous relationship with this married couple, and she deals with the kind of fallout of, what does this mean? Should she get her heart involved? This is just for, you know, fun and sexual release. There's definitely a lot of Japanese culture in this, and that, you know, Honda-san is very much the head of the household, which I kind of had to tell myself it's just part of the culture, even though it kind of irked me, but not in a poorly written way, more in a this is just truthfully what they're about way. There's a natural disaster aspect to it that I loved. The ending left a lot of mysteries that I'm really intrigued to continue with. And in general, this was just a very nice off-road erotica that is very different than any other one that I've read, and I've read a lot. And I love the polyamory. I love the non-Western setting that was very well researched. In general, it was fantastic. Next up was another romance-y type book, and that is Ascension by Rebecca Ann Stewart. This is a werewolf romance, and it might be the thing that finally made me realize I grew out of werewolf romances. This involves a young werewolf named Catwolf who wants to train to beat her pack's beta and become beta all on her own, but her father has another idea. And when they go to visit another pack for, you know, treaty and alliance purposes, that alpha basically decides to claim her, and she fights it, and over the course of the book keeps slowly giving in bit by bit. And I believe you're supposed to be a fan of that. I wasn't. I wanted her to fight him. I loved every argument they had infinitely more than any like cutesy moment. I was like, no, girl, you deserve to stand on your own 2 feet. Don't let this alpha run you around like you are your own woman. Screw him. And it was very difficult for me to continue reading this because I wanted her to fight back and break free. And yeah, go be a rogue werewolf. That sounds better than this. Like, and you were supposed to cheer her breaking down. And when there's a possible romantic rival, I was like, yes, please screw this up. And I never do that. I'm never like, oh, the love triangle, yay. I usually hate love triangles, but I genuinely wanted this relationship to be screwed up. So I don't think it will be, mostly because in almost every love triangle, you can usually tell who the person in the middle of it is going to end up with. So I'm not continuing with the series. And in general, unless it's really, really light on the werewolf aspect, I probably won't be reading a lot more werewolf-esque type romances. Maybe like 1 or 2 that I've already started and feel compelled to finish, but beyond that, it's not a genre for me anymore. Next up was my last review book for the month, not necessarily the last one I read, and that is Battle to Save the Soul of the Universe by Dwayne C. Huffman. I called this book in my review a great example of why the writing matters more than the ideas, because in this book, as you can see, it is a kind of schlocky sci-fi, but it's a sci-fi that's not quite aware of how schlocky it is. There were some fantastic ideas and some fantastic world-building elements that I really enjoyed, one of which, like, I actually put in the back of my mind for my own writing because I loved the concept of it. The writing, however, was just not there. It was very show not tell, and it was very much a struggle to connect with any of the characters because you were told things about them rather than seeing them. And it was, these 2 characters are in love now after, you know, meeting 5 pages ago. And these 2 characters are falling out with each other now. And now they're broken up in like 3 pages. And it was just a lot to go with. But the premise was there. And I actually got a comment from the author on that review. And I always get so worried when I rate below 3 stars, or even sometimes just 3 stars. But he actually said that this was really just a story he needed to get out of his head and almost like away from him, and that he wants to work on his craft and he's working on his craft. And in general, that's what I've gotten from a lot of indie authors, where if I give a slightly less stellar review. A lot of the time I've gotten replies and messages that were like asking for more critique or thanking me for the critique or saying, oh, here's how I'm going to improve myself. And I love that. I love that I can review knowing the author will see it and not have to be too afraid of like anyone getting pissy or angry or trying to like call me out or anything. The community in general definitely seems to view it as a way to improve, and I am in love with that aspect. I recently put up a video of what I've learned from Indie August and that kind of thing, so I'll link that along with the cajillion review videos below. But in general, this month has just been great for me to feel even more settled into the community, even though I'm not technically an indie author. I definitely consider myself the booktuber for indie authors or for people who want to read indie, so I love that. I feel more connected to the community than ever. Last up, the last full book I read for this month, the last one that I finished, and that was Chris Longknife, Mutineer by Mike Shepard. This is a sci-fi, military sci-fi, I guess you'd call it, from like 2004, all about a young woman named Chris Longknife who comes from a very savvy, wealthy political family but doesn't want to have any part of it. So whereas her parents want her to marry a politician and lead his campaigns, she decides to join the Navy. And she ends up in some of the worst conditions, slogging through the mud to give aid to a planet in crisis and doing kidnap rescue missions and getting caught up in the politics of it. At certain times, it's confused me a little bit because there was so much politics and talks of technology. However, I loved Chris. I loved one of her friends, and I'm calling it now, possible romantic interest in future books in the series, Tom, who was half Chinese, half Irish. So he both talked about his Chinese ancestors and like little leprechauns and fae with like equal solemnity, sobriety, equal, reverence. And I loved that. There was a lot of awesome characters that jumped off the page. I love quirky grandparent characters. They're my favorite. And in general, I loved this book for getting me geared up for September, because September is going to be a lot about sci-fi, because I am doing the Tome Infinity Challenge, and it's all international sci-fi, which I love the premise of. And I'm actually finally going to break down and read one of the major, really popular sci-fi books on BookTube, so I really hope I like it, because it'll make things so much easier if I do. So it's not quite the end of the month as I film this, but I'm not going to finish any other books before, so I'm going to cut it off here. I read, what, 12? Was that 12? I think it was 12 books this month, which, for it not being a readathon month, was really good. I think that might be the best I've ever done without having a readathon, because both months in which I read 16 books, I had a month-long readathon going. And yes, there were poetry books and mid-grade books, but I don't care. I read 12 books in a month. It's awesome. I loved Indie August. I had so much fun, but I am also equally excited to jump back into a readathon in the month of September. I'm just feeling so good about my channel right now. I recently passed 700 subscribers, which is great. I know it's very tiny in comparison to others, but I'm thankful, and I hope to keep doing this for a very long time. So with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.